Good morning, members of the board. Thank you for your time today. My name is Chikudubem Mba, and I've been asked to bring you the results of an independent audit that I carried out on an information security policy, specifically a pair of companion documents. The first one being Policy 3502, Information Security, sometimes called the Cybersecurity Policy, and Policy 3501, Acceptable Use of Information Technology. Both were produced by the British Columbia Institute of Technology, also known as BCIT, and taken to the BCIT's own Board of Governors for approval in December of 2025. I want to be transparent with you about something at the start because I think it actually strengthens the exercise rather than weakens it. BCIT is not our company. It's a public post-secondary institution in British Columbia. I selected its policy suite as the subject of this audit because it's one of the more complete, professionally governed information security policies I could find. And because walking through a real board-approved document, it lets me show you exactly the kind of review your own audit committee should expect before adopting or benchmarking against a policy like this one. So for the next 20 minutes thereabout, I'm going to do two things at once. First, I'll walk you through what I found when I audited this document purely on its own terms. Is it complete? Is it well governed? Does it hold together? And second, this is really the heart of what you asked me to do. I'll tell you what it would mean for us specifically, a company headquartered in Toronto and listed on the New York Stock Exchange, if we were to adopt a policy like this one on our own. So before I get into the findings, let me spend a minute on how I did this, because an audit opinion is only as good as the process behind it. So I reviewed the full text of both policies, the policy statement, the roles and responsibilities table, every number operative section, the definitions, the amendment history, the related legislation tables at the back of each document. I also reviewed the board decision that accompanied this draft, which was prepared jointly by BCIT's Chief Financial Officer and its Chief Information Security Officer, and which lays out the governance path these policies took to reach the board. And because you asked me to opine across three different lenses, general due diligence, Ontario legislative compliance, and New York Stock Exchange obligations, I went further and checked the current state of the external law and standard that these policies would need to sit alongside. The SEC's cybersecurity disclosure rules, which have been in force since December of 2023, the current status of Canadian federal privacy law, and a piece of Canadian cybersecurity legislation that actually just received royal assent this past June, which I'll come back to because it's directly relevant. I then organized my review around the audit question set that you gave me, documentation and management intent, policy alignment and review, scope and objectives, the control and risk management framework, employee acknowledgement, sensitive content, ownership and maintenance, the approval process itself, and control and compliance indicators, including readiness for new technology. And as instructed, I added several of my own questions where the document raised issues that weren't explicitly prompted, mostly around jurisdiction and securities disclosure, which turned out to be the two areas that matter most for our specific situation. So moving on to what the policy gets right. So I'll start with the positives because there are real ones, and I don't want the compliance gaps I'll describe later to overshadow genuinely strong work. So firstly, management intent is completely unambiguous. Both policies open a plain English policy statement and purpose section. Policy 3502 states outright that the Institute maintains and protects the confidentiality, integrity, availability, CIA, of all information under its custody or control. So that's the textbook CIA triad stated in the very first paragraph with a named approval body, the board of the governors, and named executive sponsors. There's no ambiguity about who owns this and why it exists. Second, the governance path to get these policies approved is genuinely robust. This wasn't drafted by one person or rubber stamped. Decision note traces the policy through the CISO's office, consultation with IT services, review by a risk advisory committee that pulls in privacy, people, and culture, safety and security, and enterprise risk management, review by a policy management office, a 45-day open community comment period, and optional legal review specifically checking alignment with British Columbia's privacy legislation, a recommendation from the Audit and Finance Committee, and finally, board approval. This is a multi-layer control on the policy-making process itself, and frankly, it's more rigorous than what I typically see. Third, the substantive control content is comprehensive. Policy 3502 organizes itself into 23 numbered framework domains: governance, risk management, identity and access management, asset management, data classification, encryption, network security, endpoint security, third-party risk, security awareness training, physical security, application security, database security, vulnerability and patch management, change management, business continuity, backup and disaster recovery, incident response, cloud security, human resource security, email security, ongoing compliance monitoring, and a formal exceptions process. That's a genuinely full coverage structure. And importantly, almost every obligation in it uses mandatory language. Must is required to rather than soft aspirational language. This matters because loose, non-committal language is usually the first red flag auditors look for, and I didn't find much of it there. And fourth, this one I want to highlight specifically because it's forward-looking. So Policy 3501 contains a dedicated section on responsible use of AI. It requires a formal policy and security threshold assessment before any AI tool is used in teaching or research. It explicitly bans entering confidential or personal information into unapproved AI tools, and it requires humans to review AI-generated content for accuracy, bias, and copyright compliance before it's used or shared. Frankly, a lot of organizations still don't have anything this specific on AI governance. So this is a genuine strength worth noting. Now, taking a closer look at scope, ownership, and data classification. Before I move to the gaps, let me spend a moment on three more audit questions you have asked me to address because they round out the picture of what the policy does well. So on scope, both documents are explicit and broad. They cover the Board of Governors itself, the staff, faculty, students, contractors, third-party vendors, researchers, visitors, and importantly, personal devices connecting to institutional networks. A category that's easy to leave out and often becomes the weakest link in practice. Policy 3502 goes a step further than most policies I've reviewed by explicitly extending scope to operational technology, Internet of Things devices, which matters for any organization running lab equipment, building automation, or industrial control systems, alongside standard office IT. On ownership and maintenance, Accountability is clearly assigned rather than floating. The cybersecurity office is named as the department responsible on the cover page policies, and the CISO is repeatedly identified as the final authority for approving security exceptions, for testing and maintaining the incident response plan, and for authorizing emergency response measures if a live threat emerges. There's a full role responsibility table running from the Board of Governors down to the BCIT management, instructors and teaching faculty, IT administrators, safety and security, risk management, and end users. So no one reading the policy is left wondering whose job a given obligation actually is. So where the policy falls short, I'll now turn to the gaps because these are what matter most for the opinion you asked me to give. The first gap is review cadence. Policy 3502 sets its formal review cycle at 5 years, with a vague allowance to update as needed in between. 5 years is at the outer edge of what any mature security program should tolerate for a document this central, particularly given how quickly the threat landscape and the regulatory landscape are both moving right now. Best practice reflected in frameworks like ISO 27001 Management Review Clause is closer to an annual cadence for the policy itself, even if underlying technical standards are revisited more often. The second gap is employee acknowledgement. The policy states that compliance is mandatory and that everyone must complete security awareness training, but nowhere does it describe an actual sign-off mechanism, no attestation, no click-through acceptance, nothing time-stamped that would let the organization prove after the fact that a specific individual was on notice of a specific obligation at a specific point in time. Training completion and policy acknowledgement are two different controls, and only one of them is clearly present here. The third gap, and the one I want to spend real time on because it directly answers the question you asked me to prioritize, is jurisdiction. The policy was built entirely around British Columbia law. It cites BC's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act and BC's Personal Information Protection Act repeatedly and specifically, and its entirely privacy and access framework in Section 4 of Policy 3501 is written around FIPA's Public Bodies Access Regime. Here's the problem for us. We are not a public body and we are not in British Columbia. We are a private company headquartered in Toronto. Ontario has never passed its own general private sector privacy statute. So a company like ours is governed federally by the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, not by any FIPA-style law. If we adopted this policy word for word, every legal citation anchoring our privacy obligations would be wrong for our actual jurisdiction. That's not a stylistic nitpick. It's a real compliance defect if left uncorrected. The fourth gap is specific to our New York Exchange listing, and it's arguably the most consequential one. Since December of 2023, the SEC has required public companies to disclose material cybersecurity incidents on Form 8K under Item 1.05 within 4 business days of determining the incident is material, not 4 business days from discovery, from the materiality determination itself. The SEC also requires an annual disclosure under Item 106 of Regulation SK, describing the company's cybersecurity management process, strategy, and governance, including how the board oversees cyber risk. Policy 3502 does have a solid incident response structure, a named cybersecurity incident response team, a defined activation process, an emergency authority vested in the CISOs to shut down an active threat. What it does not have is any bridge from that operational response into a securities law materiality determination. Nobody is assigned responsibility for deciding whether an incident is material in the SEC sense. There's no 4 business day clock referenced anywhere, and there's no named role for general counsel, the disclosure committee, or the CFO in that decision. For a company listed on the New York Stock Exchange, that's a meaningful gap because your audit committee is going to be asked, in essence, to certify that a process like this exists. Fifth, and more minor but still worth flagging, the encryption section requires current or higher industry standard protocols, which is sensibly future-proof in its wording, but it doesn't name the National Institute of Standards and Technology's finalized post-quantum cryptography standards published in 2024, and there's no crypto agility roadmap, given that so-called harvest now, decrypt later attacks are already recognized risk for any data with a long confidentiality horizon. This is worth addressing, though I would characterize it as a low priority item relative to the jurisdictional and disclosure gap. My opinion on the corporate and technology due diligence across each of these 3 contexts, starting with general corporate and technology due diligence. Here, viewed simply as governance artifact, the kind of thing a due diligence team requests during an acquisition, a vendor assessment, or a cyber insurance writing process. I consider this policy peer adequate and honestly above average. The layered approval process, the named accountability at every level, the breadth of control framework, and the defined incident response structure would all give a diligent reviewer real confidence that a functioning security program sits behind the document. The standard caveat applies that a policy is necessary evidence, not sufficient evidence, and a thorough diligence team would still want to see the results, the underlying technical standards library, the actual incident response plan, and a recent audit or penetration test results before signing off. But as a starting document, I would rate this well. My opinion on the Toronto and Ontario legislative compliance. On legislative compliance for a company operating in Toronto, my opinion has to be qualified. As I described earlier, the policy's entire legal foundation is built for a British Columbia public body. Adopted as is, it would misstate the law that actually applies to us. We need PIPEDA, not BC's FIPA or Personal Information Protection Act under Bill C8. My opinion is that in its current form, policy is not legislatively adequate for a Toronto headquartered private company. It requires targeted amendment, not a rebuild, but a real amendment before it could be adopted as our own governing document. On the New York Stock Exchange listing, the opinion is qualified and for similar reasons. The operational bones of the incident response process are sound, but the policy is silent on the specific mechanics the SEC now requires, which is a materiality determination process, a 4 business day disclosure clock tied to Form 8K, Item 1.05, an annual Form 10K narrative on cyber governance under Item 106, and a documented recurring cadence for board-level cyber risk reporting. My opinion is that this policy is not adequate for a New York Stock Exchange listed company without adding an explicit securities disclosure bridge and a defined board reporting rhythm. So my combined opinion and conclusion, bringing all 3 together, I'm giving you what I'll describe as a qualified opinion in the same sense an external auditor issues a qualified opinion on a set of financial statements. The underlying control framework in this policy is sound, well governed, and reflects genuinely good practice. I would not hesitate to use it as a strong starting template, but it cannot be adopted word for word by a company in our position. It needs targeted, identifiable amendments in three areas: the jurisdictional legal references, the securities disclosure procedure, and the review cadence. Importantly, none of those three amendments require rebuilding the underlying security program. They layer on top of a framework that is structurally already doing most of the work correctly. That distinction is exactly why I'm confident the five recommendations I'll walk you through in the next video are practical, targeted, and genuinely cost-effective, rather than a call for a wholesale rewrite. I'd also add one broader observation before I close, because I think it's useful context for how the board thinks about this exercise going forward. The fact that this policy is so close to adequate rather than fundamentally flawed is itself informative. It tells us that a well-run information security policy doesn't need to be reinvented from scratch every time an organization crosses a jurisdictional or regulatory boundary. What it needs is a deliberate process for retesting a policy's assumption, whether the organization's footprint changes, whether that's a new province, a new country, a stock exchange listing, or a new critical infrastructure classification. I would suggest that process itself, a formal jurisdictional and regulatory applicability review, triggered whenever our corporate footprint changes materially, is something worth bringing into our own governance model, regardless of what we decide about this particular template. I also want to be candid about the limits of what I would access from the document alone. A policy is a statement of intent and control framework on paper. It is not by itself proof that controls are operating effectively day to day. To move from this opinion to something closer to unqualified confidence, the next phase of work would need to include a review of the actual technical standards library that this policy defers to, the real incident response plan, and evidence that it has been tested through tabletop exercises, recent penetration test, and vulnerability scan results, and the evidence of this training completion and phishing simulation metrics referenced in Section 10. None of that is unusual to ask for. It's the normal second phase of any serious due diligence engagement. But I want to be clear that today's opinion is scoped to the written policy itself, not to BCIT's actual operating environment, which I have no visibility into and I'm not in a position to access. So to summarize where that leaves us, this is a strong template with three specific fixable gaps relative to our situation: jurisdiction, security disclosure, and review cadence, plus two smaller items worth addressing opportunistically, being formal employee acknowledgement and post-quantum cryptography planning. None of that requires abandoning the underlying framework. It requires a focused amendment exercise, which is exactly what I'll walk you through next. Thank you for your time and attention today. I'll pause here, and in the follow-up presentation, I'll take you through five specific prioritized recommendations with the reasoning and the framework behind each one.